Climate change – some adverse effects of climate changes to agricultural productions. Some lands are unsuitable for growing crops. There will be millions of people facing hunger in Africa in the future. Climate change will result in less production and less food. It is difficult for developing countries to deal with climate change due to their financial status and other issues. There are many people living in hunger, especially in Africa. The climate change has devastating effects on world economy. The tropical areas on Earth are dry and hot, and are originally not suitable for food production. The change of the climate leads to extreme weather conditions such as flood and hurricane, which exacerbates the food production. As a result, it leads to a continuous decline in food supply annually around 10 to 17%. And this trend is perceived to be continue in the future by 2070. The regions suffering the most will be some African countries.
This week I'd like to start by talking a bit about electric vehicles. Although we tend to think of electric cars as being something completely modern, they were in fact some of the earliest types of motorised vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, electric cars were actually more popular than cars with an internal combustion engine, as they were more comfortable to ride in. However, as cars fuelled by petrol increased in importance, electric cars declined. The situation became such that electric vehicles were only used for certain specific purposes, as forklift trucks, ambulances, and urban delivery vehicles, for example. Although electricity declined in use in road vehicles, it steadily grew in importance as a means of powering trains. Switzerland, for example, was quick to develop an electrified train system, encouraged in this, no doubt, by the fact that it had no coal or oil resources of its own. Nowadays, there is renewed interest in electricity as a means of powering road vehicles. Why is this the case? Well, undoubtedly, economic reasons are of considerable importance. The cost of oil has risen so sharply that there is a strong financial imperative to look for an alternative. However, there are also environmental motivations. Emissions from cars are blamed in large part for, among other things, the destruction of the ozone layer and the resultant rise in temperatures in the polar regions. A desire not to let things get any worse is also encouraging research into designing effective electric transport.
Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it and what does it mean? When at UCL Center for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to assess the environment at another historic library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books. And we were also asked, for the first time really, I was actually quite taken aback by the brief. We were asked, whatever you do, please preserve the smell. It's so important to our audience. It's so important how people perceive the library. So that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company, because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight, obviously, to interact with the environment. But on the second place, we see that smell is also very, very important.
Let's take a look at this video of these little kids. They were offered the option of having one marshmallow immediately or 2 marshmallows 15 minutes later. And you've got some very cute videotape of this experiment, so let's take a look. Okay.
What we found is a very simple and direct way of measuring a competence that seems to make an important life difference.
A researcher tells these preschoolers that she's going to leave the room. If they wait for her to come back without eating the marshmallows, they'll get 2 marshmallows. Or they can ring the bell and she'll come back right away. But then they only get 1 marshmallow.
I won't ring the bell.
You won't ring the bell? Okay. Looking at children over time, Dr. Michel has found that being able to wait longer at 4 has some pretty powerful implications.
And what are those powerful implications? Is that that later in life they're more disciplined and have more self-control? Is that pretty much it?
Well, they are more likely to achieve their life goals. They have better relationships. They did better on their SAT tests.
I know, that's crazy, all because they waited 15 minutes for two marshmallows?
I mean, I think it is crazy. I probably would have eaten all three. But
yeah, me too.
But, you know, actually, yes, the ability to be able to pursue your goals, in this case it was to have two marshmallows versus one, and not go on automatic and just grab the marshmallow, is a very important skill. But I think a main point in Mind in the Making is that these skills can be taught if you're 14 or 40 or 4. It's not ever too late, and any child can learn them, any adult can teach them, and it's never too late.
When this dog approaches some food, another dog's playful snarls are played back. The dog seems curious, but the sound doesn't stop it from taking the bone. Here, a dog hears the growls of a dog being approached by a stranger. But these don't deter it from grabbing the bone either. In another scenario, the sound of a dog protecting its food is played back. This time, the dog backs off. These experiments suggest that dogs can distinguish between different types of growls.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then, these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, finished, that had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labour, and that is their primary purpose in society.
Our friends at the Highlands Museum and Discovery Centre in Ashland, Kentucky, asked a very good question. Why is it dark in space? That question is not as simple as it may sound. You might think that space appears dark at night because that is when our side of Earth faces away from the sun as our planet rotates on its axis every 24 hours. But what about all those other faraway suns that appear as stars in the night sky? Our own Milky Way contains over 200 billion stars, and the entire universe contains over 100 billion galaxies. You might suppose that that many stars would light the night sky like daytime. Until the 20th century, astronomers didn't think it was even possible to count all the stars in the universe. They thought the universe went on forever. In other words, they thought the universe was infinite. Besides being very hard to imagine, the trouble with an infinite universe is that no matter where you look in the night sky, you should see a star. Stars should overlap with each other in the sky like tree trunks in the middle of a very thick forest. But if this were the case, the sky would be blazing with light. The problem greatly troubled these astronomers and became known as Olbers' paradox. A paradox that is a statement that seems to disagree with itself. So, to try and explain this paradox, some 19th century scientists thought that dust clouds between the stars must be absorbing a lot of the starlight, so it wouldn't shine through to us. But later, scientists realized that the dust itself would absorb so much energy from the starlight that eventually it would glow as hot and as bright as the stars themselves. Astronomers now realize that the universe is not infinite. A finite universe. That is, a universe of limited size. Even one with trillions and trillions of stars just wouldn't have enough stars to light up all of space. Although the idea of a finite universe explains why Earth's sky is dark at night, other causes work to make it even darker.
Haussmann's renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and directed by his prefect of the Seine, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods, the building of wide avenues, parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers, fountains and aqueducts. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870, but work on his projects continued until 1927. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today is largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. In the middle of the 19th century, the center of Paris was overcrowded, dark, dangerous, and unhealthy. In 1845 the French social reformer Victor Considerant wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants shrivel and perish, and where, of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." The street plan on the Taille de la Cite and in the neighborhood called the Quartier des Arcs, between the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville City Hall. Haussmann's renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and directed by his prefect of the Seine, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods, the building of wide avenues, parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers, fountains and aqueducts. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870, but work on his projects continued until 1927. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today is largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. In the middle of the 19th century, the center of Paris was overcrowded, dark, dangerous, and unhealthy. In 1845, the French social reformer Victor Considerant wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants shrivel and perish, and where, of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." The street plan on the Taille de la Cite and in the neighborhood called the Quartier des Arcs, between the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville City Hall, had changed little since the Middle Ages. The population density in these neighborhoods was extremely high, compared with the rest of Paris. In the neighborhood of the Champs-Élysées, there was one.
Mars is 4th planet from the Sun and the 2nd smallest planet in the solar system after Mercury, named after the Roman god of war. It is often referred to as a red planet because the iron oxide prevalent on its surface gives it a reddish appearance. Mars is a terrestrial planet with a thin atmosphere, having surface features reminiscent both of the inner crater of the Moon and the volcanoes, valleys, deserts, and polar ice caps of the Earth. The rotational period and the seasonal cycles of the Mars are likewise similar to those of Earth, as it was the tilt that produces the seasons. Mars is the site of the Olympus Mons, the largest volcano and the 2nd largest known mountain in the solar system, and the Valles Marineris, one of the largest canyons in the solar system. Until the first successful Mars flyby in 1965 by Mariner 4, many speculated about the presence of liquid water on the planet's surface. This was based on observed periodic variation in the light and dark patches, particularly in the polar latitude, which appeared to be seas and continents. Geological evidence gathered by the unmanned mission suggested that Mars once have large scale of water coverage on the surface on some earlier stages of existence.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth which brings wealth in order to cut poverty without damaging biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal. But if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing or reducing economic growth. And we're used in developed countries, industrialized countries, to seeing this argument, this axis argued about with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X, which is full of wildlife, and the Wildlife Conservation Society is urging them not to on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We're used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world there's a third axis, and it's quite a complex one.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
A language dies when the last person who speaks it dies. But you know, sometimes people say it dies when the second last person who speaks it dies, because then the last person has nobody to talk to. Well, of course, languages have come and gone throughout history as communities have come and gone. But what's happening now is something really quite extraordinary. Well, there are about 6,000 languages in the world at the moment, more or less. Nobody knows the exact number. And of these, people think that about half of them are so seriously endangered that they're likely to die out in the course of the present century. Now, the present century is 100 years, half is 3,000 languages, so that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world, on average, every 2 weeks. There are all kinds of reasons why languages die. One is the physical reasons, when people are affected by famine and disease and earthquake. Another is genocide, when some countries deliberately try and stamp out a small language. But the main reason is globalization. That is, there are some huge languages in the world like English and Arabic and Spanish and French, and these are like steamrollers, crushing the smaller languages that they find in their path. A great deal can be done to preserve an endangered language. The first thing is that the people themselves must want the language to be preserved. That's very important. The second thing is that the powers that be must want the language to be preserved. They must have a respect for the minority languages that are in their care. And the third thing that has to be there, of course, is cash. It costs quite a lot of money to preserve an endangered language. Think about it. You have to train the teachers, you have to write books for the children, and all that sort of thing. It doesn't cost an extraordinary amount of money, but it does cost a bit. So without money, endangered languages don't have a positive future.
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man. Over a period of almost 50 years, he was a literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and dedicated journal keeper.
And this illustration often used is the one of the monkeys at the typewriter. Okay, so we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is, basically, if you leave chance and time long enough, you will get life, don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange, yes, it's wonderful, but leave enough matter, 600 million years on Earth, and you will have life. So the monkey's sitting at the typewriter, and the chances are, eventually, he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? But he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do to run the numbers is instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare, I just ran the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing at 1 keystroke a second to type to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend at 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers, to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase. And a DNA string, that complexity emerged by chance, undirected, within 600 million years. Again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have, that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life is simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was.
The way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching, and archback nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming, and there are rats that do very little, but most rats are in between. So that resembles human behavior as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you do, you observe them and you put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring, and the low lickers in another cage. And then you let them grow, and they're adults now. The mothers are long buried, and you look in the brain, and you see that those who had high-licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those who are low lickers express very little. That reflects in the number of receptors, and that results in a different stress response. But this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get a mutation, a polymorphism once in a million, here just the motherly love changes hundreds of genes in one shot. And it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also say it by behavior. So if you walk to the cages, to the room, the rats that were poorly licked are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive. And the rats that were very well handled as little pups, they are much more relaxed, much easier to handle. So, like every technician in the lab knows, looking at the adult rat, how it was licked when it was a little pup. And the question, of course, is mechanism. How does this work?